Welcome back to Knowledge is Kings, guys. I am Kings, and today I'm going to attempt to make a wooden lightsaber with some epoxy as well. This project was a request from one of my subscribers, Ethanian2132, so thank you for the suggestion. I'm not going to make a full-size lightsaber, but a smaller version that I think would be nice as a nightlight. Let's get to it. To start, I'm going to glue some maple together for the handle of the lightsaber. While that sets up, I'm going to start making the blade. This will be made from epoxy, so I need to make a form for it first. I have made quite a few large river tables, and this is how I make most all of my forms for those. I cut melamine to the size I need. I then place them all together and tape them as one big unit. Typically this saves some tape when taping them all together, but I'm not sure if on this small project I actually saved any, but this is how I always do it. This is house wrap tape. I don't remember where I got this, maybe Home Depot or something. I think it's the best tape because epoxy won't stick to it even without form release. After they are all taped together, I cut them into individual pieces. Whenever I use melamine, I need to pre-drill holes before screwing them together, otherwise it'll crack. Once it is screwed together, I use caulk to seal up all the edges. Silicone is a far better product than caulk, but it is unnecessary for this. Caulk goes on very easily, is easily spreadable, it cleans up with water, and it is way cheaper than silicone. Out of the 20 forms I have made, I have never had one leak, even when reusing them, and 4 of them were round forms. So if you take your time, 1 layer of caulk on the inside corners is enough. I put a bead on all 8 corners and then push it into the crack and smooth it out by running my finger over it. This is what it should look like once the caulk is applied. I do not need to wait for it to dry before I put epoxy into it. As I'm pouring this in a volume that is too much for my tabletop and art epoxy, I'm using my deep pour epoxy, which I have available on my website, kingswoodshopusa.com. Once measuring out the right 2-to-1 ratio, I mix it thoroughly. The number one problem epoxy users face is uncured epoxy, which happens when it isn't mixed enough. Once I have it mixed enough, I add the dye, then I mix it more. When I have the color I think I'm going for, I pour it into the mold. I only made enough to fill half the mold. I don't worry about the bubbles as they will all rise to the top and pop on their own over time. I poured all the epoxy into the mold, but something happened to the end of the video, so you don't get to see that. While that epoxy sets up, I work on the LEDs that I will put in the center of the blade. I solder a length of wire to the first LED and then take out my template I cut out for what I want my handle to look like and make sure the wire is long enough to reach through it. I'm using blue wire as it will be visible in the blade, and I thought blue would look less conspicuous in the blue colored epoxy. I'm no soldering expert, but when you solder, it works best to add a little solder to each end of the wire that you want to put together, then join the two together. Once I had the 2 lengths of LEDs together, it was time to put it into the center of the blade. I used CA glue and accelerant to hold the wire in place. I wasn't crazy about this idea because the glue will be somewhat visible through the epoxy, but I couldn't think of another way to do it easily that wouldn't be visible. When the ends of the wire are glued in, I test it to make sure everything works. Then I glue in between the glue spots, and then I test it again. Now I'm ready to pour the rest of the epoxy, but I thought I should sand the first layer to help with adhesion of the next layer of epoxy, which I should have done before I put the lights in. So I gave it a perfunctory sanding on each side of the LEDs. Then I poured the newly mixed epoxy into the form. Anywhere where bubbles got trapped under the wires, I poured some epoxy right over it to move the bubbles out from under the wire so they wouldn't get trapped there. I covered the epoxy so dust from my shop won't get into it. By then the glue was set up, so I turned back to the handle. I smooth out a side on the jointer, then I cut it into a hexagon on the table saw. I mount it on my lathe with a copy jig mounted to the lathe. I'm not going to use the jig to make the handle, but just to get the handle to a perfect circle to start off from. You can see I have a model cut out of what I want the handle to look like, and I have it mounted into the copy jig just so I make sure not to cut too deeply. You can see I'm down far enough, so far that the jig started to copy my design. So it was time to take the jig off since I want to make the handle myself. I use my model to check my progress often. Once I have it as far as I want, I cut it free. I remount it into the lathe so I can cut out a section for the blade to go into. Then I sand the ends on the belt sander. I need to drill a hole to go all the way through for the wires for the lights, which I do very carefully so I don't come through a side or snap the handle in half. Then it's back to the blade. I use a chisel to pry the form off the epoxy. It comes off pretty easily. You can see the caulk never even cured before I poured it in, and since it couldn't get air, it never cured. I put it on my lathe and tried to get it to a nice cylindrical shape. And if you watch my epoxy cut video, you know how much I struggle with epoxy on the lathe. Well, not much has changed. So after trying to make it work for a while, I chucked it up onto my CNC lathe to have it make it into a cylinder for me. It was going great until the one end moved. Then the whole circle was off center. So this was after hours of trying. I decided to use my joiner to not only make it a cylinder, but also taper it as I wanted. I'm not going to show my technique for this as it's not very safe, but I was able to do it in a few minutes and it saved me lots of headache. Once I had the shape I wanted, I put it back on the lathe to sand it. This was precarious and I needed to hold the end of the whole time so it didn't wobble. But it was going well and I should have had it polished up in no time. So it broke. Saw how I was sanding it, holding it steady on one end. Well, when the camera wasn't recording, I had moved my hand like this and it wobbled and snapped and flew off, breaking the LEDs in the process. Now, I believe these LEDs will still work. But two problems kind of happened here. One, it broke in half easily, clearly, smoothly, where the two layers were. So that makes me wonder about the rigidity of this. I should have sanded it more to give better adhesion, but I had already put the wires in, so I couldn't really sand it that much. The other problem is that, let's see if we can see this on here, it now fractured kind of along that line. I'm not sure if that's really visible or not, but where I couldn't see where the two pieces joined together, now I can clearly see it. So I was tempted to give this up, end this project here, and just never post it. But I think what I'm going to do is cut it at just above the brake line. Now the problem is this other end fit in here perfectly before without any wiggle room. It was like a perfect fit. But this blade is tapered, so I'm afraid once I cut it off, it will no longer fit into the notch I have there. I think I'm just going to have to deal with that, and maybe what I'll do is, as I'm going to paint this, once I get this in, I can put filler in around so you won't be able to tell. As you can see, I'm not not too excited about that happening. And instead of sanding it, I think what I'm going to do now, so I took some UV cure epoxy and put it on this half. Now it got covered in dust now, but it allows it to be really transparent compared to this. Actually, maybe I'll just show you what that looks like. You can see that does a fairly decent job of making it clear instead of sanding it. So I think what I'm going to do is I might just give it a hand scuffing or two of a little finer grit, and then I'm going to dump 2-part epoxy over the whole thing. And then I'll cut the end off and try to salvage the wires and the LEDs. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I mounted the blade into a block with some overflow holes drilled in so excess epoxy didn't go all over my bench. I glue it in with UV cure resin. For this, I'm using my tabletop and art epoxy. While that sets up, I'll work on the handle some more. I made this little U-shaped cut on the end using the router table. Then I painted the whole handle silver, and unfortunately the camera never focused on the handle. But once that was cured, my wife painted the rest for me using black on the inside notches and gold for one small little section. I think this really completes the look of the handle. So I cut the blade off of the block and cut the wires free and soldered new wires on them, securing them in place further with UV cure resin. Now I need to solder those wires onto the power adapter, and then glue the blade onto the handle. And with that, the lightsaber was done. So I only managed to get one picture of the lightsaber after it was finished. Before, as I was cleaning off my table and I tried to sand some epoxy off of it, it vibrated the table enough where I didn't notice that the lightsaber was going off towards the edge where it fell off and broke. So I don't have anything to show for it as it's broken now. All I had was that one picture. And with the frustration mounting high on this project, I'm going to call it quits for there. I may finish it in the future or try to somehow fix it back together, but not feeling real happy about this one right now. I had intended on sending this to Epoxy as he suggested the project, but as it's broken, I won't be able to do that now. Also, before I finish this video, I want to clarify that the part of the reason I have such a hard time with the epoxy on the lathes this time was because it was still soft. I did not give it enough time to cure because I thought it might be easier to work with on the lathe. And it did chip less than my epoxy cup did, being soft, but it also caused other problems. That's why it moved on the CNC lathe. It was so soft that it shifted down in the point of the lathe. So I need to find an in-between cure time for lathe work. Anyway, that's all I have for this video. Be sure to like this video as it really helps out the channel, and consider subscribing so you don't miss out on any future videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. So I got it put back together in a way that looks like it never broke, but as you can see, there's something wrong with the LEDs now. There's some type of a loose connection or something, but it's inside the blade itself, because inside the handle everything is still good. And also, I don't know, this paint on the handle, this spray paint, had sat cured for 2 days, but as you can see with me handling it, the paint just got all scuffed up, so it would need a new paint job. But the problem is, if I move it, the LEDs sometimes will shut off entirely, or at least half of them will. But I guess on the lighter note, it's kind of together, and if you don't move it, sometimes the lights will stay on, so it's better than where it was yesterday. But this is just a few hours before this is going to post, and I can't really do anything more on it. So that's it, but at least I'm ending it with it put together.
Oh, I like that.